Hi, and welcome to another installment of Learning with Power. And my name is Scott Powers Houston, and this is episode 18. It's called the Hazara Jat Plan. Now, this plan was a plan that I put together several years ago with the help of a friend named Mohammed, who is from Afghanistan, and he had a dream of creating a new empire in Afghanistan called Hazara Jat. And he wanted this to be a completely secular government. He did not, he said he and his people, the Hazara people, which are a significant cultural group, ethnic group within Afghanistan, they're tired of the Taliban. They don't care about being Muslim, it's not important. They want a secular government, and they want to make, they want to have more modern living. They don't want to live and most of the Hazara people have had many of their family members murdered by the Taliban, because that's what they do. So we put together a plan to create a new country within Afghanistan called Hazara Jat. H-A-Z-A-R-A, you can see it in the write-up. And now the Hazara people, goes back to the 1221, with the siege of Bamyan, with the Genghis Khan, and the descendants from basically the Mongols created ultimately the Hazara people, and they've evolved into their own, like I said, ethnic group, which also includes they also live in India, northern India, these Hazara people as well. Okay, and so my friend said he wants me to help him come up with a plan, which we presented to various countries and embassies. We won't get into details about that, but ultimately we never got the funding for it, even though it was a billion-dollar plan, multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar even plan. And now Biden's done what he's done, and now the Taliban have absolute power, so there's no chance really in executing the Hazara Jat plan anymore. Thank you, Joe. But anyway, all those people are going to be left to suffer indefinitely under the vicious, autocratic, fascist rule of the Taliban. We totally screwed up Afghanistan. If you've seen the movie called Charlie Wilson's War, he says we screwed up the end game at the end of the movie, which is true. We did that, and we did it big time. And then when we went back in 2001, we again screwed up the end plan, the end game, and we put in Muslim leaders, which really it was not necessary. And this is what I explained to my friend Muhammad. I said, even if we win the war, and because this plan also calls for what we would do as far as militarily, how you could militarily shut out the Taliban from this particular part of Afghanistan called Bamyan, and how logistically that could be done, and even where to get the weapons on the cheap. Like he had access to all these different websites for buying, tanks, surface-to-air missiles, all kinds of things on the cheap. And so we could get actual concrete numbers for what it would cost to have a military excursion or a military opposition, that we could present against the Taliban. And it could be done for not that much money. And why the United States government didn't try harder to get rid of the Taliban, I have no idea. There was some bad intel there, I guess. I don't know. But they completely screwed it up. And what they did not do, which they should have done, was they should have put a lot of the money that they were putting into Afghanistan into infrastructure. Buildings, schools, roads, things, for the people. But America is so about corporations that the whole concept of for the people is just gone. Nothing that America does anymore, and nothing that America stands for or represents anymore, has anything to do with for the people. It only has to do with corporate profits. And so the corporations that were sponsoring all the different soldiers of fortune and the mercenaries and all the different corporate interests that there were, Halliburton, things like that in Afghanistan, you know, they wanted to run things their way, and they wanted to do things so that they could continue to generate as much profit as possible. They really didn't give a squat about the Afghan people or what happened with Afghanistan. And because America did not ultimately give a squat about what happened with the Afghan people, what we got was a complete cluster, you know what, and a disaster, and which became cemented in stone when Biden said, oh, we give up, and the Taliban, of course, took everything over. So part of this plan was that my friends said, well, I said, here's the thing. I said, lots of revolutions have been won, but the problem is they didn't have a very good end game planned out ahead of time. Even you could look at the Cuban Revolution and things like that, you know, and they were like, oh, we won. Oh, okay, now what? And they didn't really know, and so then the governments that they wind up going to are usually worse than the ones that they overthrew. Like in the Middle East, like with the Arab Spring, and like I said, in Cuba. None of these people had a well-planned end game, and that's the most important thing, most important aspect of any revolution. You have to have a well-planned end game, because what if you win, you know? Because, you know, revolutions win a lot because people are zealous and they're enthusiastic and they're like, yeah, let's revolt, you know, out of it with this crap, you know, and so a lot of times just that zeal and enthusiasm is enough to push them forward and gain a victory. And so I said, well, if we win, he says, well, you tell me what government, what social systems, socioeconomic systems should we set up? And I said, well, I do have a plan for that. And so that's why I'm talking about the Hazara Jat plan now. And then he also said, he said, what do you want for this? You know, and I said, you know, it's part of what I do, but let's just say that if you win, I want my face to be on the money. And he says, deal. So that would have been cool, huh? You know, you watch him walking into a market and buying something and going, you know, and they're like, this is you. That's right, I have my own money. Yep. Anyway, we tried. Okay, so the government that I proposed was actually a form of democracy, ultimately, is what I chose. So we talked about before in previous episodes that basically when you're establishing a new government, what you want to do is so not only do you want to separate church and state, and that was something that the forefathers 200 years ago understood, that you need to separate church and state. Because previously, you know, during the Middle Ages, the church became such a dominant force in all society and culture that it literally controlled, they had too much power. And so they saw that that was a problem, and so they said, we got to eliminate church and state. But what's happened since 1787 is we have had this thing called the Industrial Revolution. Hey, and now we have a big thing with business and moneyed interests and corporate interests. So now the most important thing with establishing a new government is to separate corporate and business interests from state affairs, because corporations do not have the best interests of the people at heart and at all. So their interests need to be mitigated and separated from the affairs of state. That's probably the most important thing that has to be done in the new government of today. And the second thing that you have to have with any kind of a government is you have to have the power to recall. Because if you don't, you know, like, well, a lot of people say it was Voltaire, but actually it was another man, Lord, was an English guy in the 1800s. I can't remember his name right now. But he said absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's true in a lot of cases. Which is the problem with having a benevolent dictator, is ultimately sometimes the benevolent dictator goes rogue, kind of like what Putin did. I mean, for about 15 years or so, Putin was actually a very good president. He was actually very beneficial to the Russian people and to the Russian cause and progress and redeveloping Russia after the devastation of what happened after the fall of the communist empire. But then he went rogue. And all of my Russian friends actually sent me emails and stuff apologizing for it. Because they're like, look, we didn't expect this, you know. So you need the power to recall. If somebody goes rogue, you need to be able to recall that person. Okay. Ultimately, so we have a form of democracy, but we talked about in the last episode what's wrong with democracy. So first of all, the thing you have to understand about America is that no one in America actually lives in a democracy. No one. Not one person in America actually lives their day-to-day lives in a democracy. Because we get up and we go to work. And at work, there is an absolute dictator. The business head who dictates what we have to do all day long. And so that's not a democracy, is it? So we're always controlled by some sort of a boss. And sometimes a boss can be who you live with, you know, people that surround you or whatever. But ultimately, everybody has to answer to a boss. So nobody actually really lives in a democracy in America. That's one thing we need to understand. Secondly, if you have a democracy, you can't allow everybody to vote. Sorry, you can't. If you allow the idiot masses, let's say, to vote too much, if they have too much influence, then you have what I call before, you have anyway, you have the masses control everything, and ultimately we have the lowest common denominator wins. And that you can see that with marketing, you know, in markets around the United States and around the world. You know, what emerges is basically the things that appeal to the dumb masses. That's what wins. The good products don't have a chance. And so you have tyranny of the masses. That's it. That's what I was going to say. Or tyranny by the masses. So you have to avoid that. Okay. Now, we also need to have freedom of speech. The other thing we don't have in America anymore is freedom of speech. We absolutely do not have freedom of speech anymore. There are a lot of things that it's actually illegal for us to say. And I think our forefathers wouldn't even understand how that could even be possible. But there are a lot of things that we are not allowed to say. A lot of things. And as social media has taken over and controlling everything more, we have less and less and less freedom of speech. We really do not have freedom of speech in America anymore. We really don't. And it's important to preserve freedom of speech because not having freedom of speech compromises having an effective way to recall the rogue leader. Because ultimately, if you don't have freedom of speech, then you don't have any way to say, wait a minute, this guy is bad. That guy needs to be removed. And when you lose the ability to be able to say that, like they've lost that in Russia and in many other countries, then you don't have the means anymore to recall a rogue leader. So that's why you need to preserve freedom of speech. It's very important to do that. Now, another thing about America is that America is completely corrupt. And America is, in fact, run by lobbies. And so all the things that everybody complains about in America and says, yeah, why is America like this? Why does America do that? Why don't they do that? That's not the best thing for the people. Even if you have the wherewithal to understand that, most people don't understand that the reason why everything in America is screwed up is because America is in fact controlled by lobbies. So you have the oil lobby, and you have the automotive lobby, and you have the tax lobby. America is the only country in the world where the people have to pay somebody to do their taxes every year. Nobody else does that. And it's not necessary. We've got the computer infrastructure that the government knows how much money we made and how much taxes we made and how much taxes we owe. They know. We don't have to tell them. So why do we still have to file taxes every year? Because of the tax lobby. Yep. Okay, so the reason we have to file taxes every year is strictly because of the tax lobby and not for any other reason. The reason why cars are so dominant and we don't really have much public transportation in America is because of the automotive lobby, which is a very strong thing. We have the gun lobby as well, so we'll never get rid of guns either because the gun lobby is very strong in America. If you look at a map of all the trains that run across the country, and you look at America and you compare that to Europe, or any place else, even Asia now, there's this grid of train routes and all that goes across Europe. People ride trains every day in Europe. Every day they ride the train in Europe. In America, where's all that infrastructure? We don't have it. We're supposed to be a first world country. We're not, actually. We don't have very many rail lines in America because of the automotive lobby. And in fact, it's really a big difference. It's like probably 100-fold more rail lines in Europe than there is in America. In Europe, people ride the trains every day. In America, it's like people say to each other, "Have you ever ridden on a train before?" And the answer sometimes is, "No, I've never been on a train before." Ever in their lives. So that's quite a difference from everyday use to never in my life. So if you think America's a first world country, think again. It's not. It doesn't have the infrastructure, really. It has banking infrastructure. Oh yeah. Anything that benefits corporations, that infrastructure is the best in the world. But for things that would benefit the people, no, not at all. Okay, so what was my proposed government for Hazara Jat? Stop. Okay, and the government that I would do is actually very similar in structure and in concept to what they did, in America. The original plan of the original founding fathers of America was good, and in 1787 it was brilliant. They did not understand, though, that what money and private interests and corporate power and the Industrial Revolution and all that, how that would have a profound influence on the government and socioeconomic, elements of the country. How could they know? They didn't have a crystal ball. So that happened since then. We need a new government now to deal with the fact that that profound thing has happened. The problem is we're not going to get a new government because the powers that be, the money, they don't want any changes. They like the way things are. They like that they get to make as many profits as they possibly can without any regard to for the benefit of the people or not. They don't care. They like it that way. And the elite billionaires in America, and there's more in America of them in America than anywhere else, love it the way that it already is. And if you're an elite billionaire, then America, that is the place for you. But for anybody else, even millionaires today are middle class. If you have a net worth of like $2 million, that's good, but you're actually middle class. And so you really should want changes. The masses really should want changes. Okay. So basically, my idea was to have a democracy that had lateral powers for the leader with the authority to remove by the people if the leader becomes too powerful or goes rogue. Okay? And complete separation of business and church, business affairs and church affairs from affairs of the state. So you might need to have a very secular government, which with Hazara Jat, as I was told, that would be fine. And that's what America should have done. They should have set up a secular government. For the people the intel that said, no, you need to have a Muslim government or people are going to rebel against that. That was bad intel. That was very bad intel. And they don't really understand what's going on there. Because you see, the people in Afghanistan were very tired of wars and very tired that all these wars basically were inspired by religion. And so they were over it. But the intel, for some reason, the FBI, CIA, whatever, told the government, America and interests that, oh no, you have to have a Muslim government. Well, that was a screw up. Okay, so the basic government setup would be, okay, you still want to have 3 branches of government. That's a good idea. And you want to have checks and balances, but you need to really have checks and balances. Like I said, you need to be able to recall people. Another problem we have in America is that, like senators and congressmen, we don't have any term limits. We need to have term limits for people like that. You've got people who are 80 years old that are, like Dianne Feinstein or whatever, that are still controlling things and still have a vote when they shouldn't, because they have no clue what's going on anymore. So you have the legislative branch, okay, and so you need to have a referendum democracy. Now, referendum democracy means the people vote. So you no longer need representative democracy, as I said before. You can have direct democracy, just like they had in ancient Athens, because we have this thing called the iPhone, the smartphone. Wait, I don't have mine on me ever. It's somewhere, but this is Ed's. So because we have this thing, we don't need representative democracy anymore. Technology is there. We don't have to do that anymore. So we should have what's called referendum democracy, which is the people vote directly. And a civics test should be required for voting. It's another thing that you could have an app on your iPhone for that. You can have an app on your iPhone for civics test, and you can just keep taking it until you pass if you want. I mean, if you really want to vote, it's there for you, but you're going to have to know your stuff. So even if you cram and try to just study before you take this civics exam and you barely pass, even that kind of studying actually does cement some knowledge into people's heads. It forces them to familiarize themselves at least with what's going on. Even just that is enough. So you have a civics test that is going to be that there's going to be an app on your iPhone, and you have to pass this test in order to be able to vote. And if you don't care about voting, well then don't bother. All right, and so we need to have a higher classification of voting depending upon what tests. Oh yeah, so also not only should there be civic tests, but there should actually be different levels, okay? Because not everybody needs to vote on everything. So if we have referendum democracy, that means the people vote on everything, including whether or not you need to have certain requirements for licenses, or whether or not they're going to build a park or a zoo, or whether or not they're going to they're going to expand a freeway, or whether or not they're going to approve of this new bridge that's being built across the bay or something. And they're not civil engineers, and so they shouldn't be voting on things like that. Senators do, and congressmen do, and they shouldn't. They have committees that they set up to study this plan, and then the committee comes back with a recommendation. But they themselves should have some basic knowledge, and so you need to have different tests that you can pass to vote on different things, and I think that only makes sense. Nobody knows about everything. Not even me. So people shouldn't be voting on everything. They should only be voting on things that they do know about. Okay, so they need to have higher classification. Okay, we need to have a speaker for the legislative branch. It can be a Speaker of the House or a Prime Minister or whatever you want to call them. And most importantly, probably we need to have term limits. Okay, then we need to have different ministers from each province. So you still want to have a house where they debate things like that, and you still want to have another democracy where they vote as well. And so even though we have a referendum democracy, you still also want to have debate on the floor of what you call parliament or senate or something like that. And you should have one representative from each province, but also you should have a representative from each social class, and each, social, like distinctive, the LGBT people or whatever. I mean, everybody should have their own representative. And there should be a process to file for representation. We want to have our own group and we want to have representation. Well, there should be a process by which they can file to get representation. Because as the world changes and society changes and culture changes and people's attitudes and things change, you need to have the ability to be fluid there, to have different representation from different demographic or societal groups that change and ebb and evolve over time, you know. And so you need to be the ability to be able to be a little bit fluid that way, to allow different types of representation. You also should do like what they do in Canada, and that is they should have what's called a Ministry of the Ombudsman, which monitors other ministers and presidential cabinet. And the ombudsman is very important in terms of being able to recall. So if the ombudsman determines that there's too much corruption going on in some office, then that's where you can put in the authority to initiate a vote or a referendum, to have a vote, to have a withdrawal, to where we get rid of that person in power. All right. And also we should have a federally funded, as I said before, entrepreneur association, where we actually promote the people. We promote ideas by the people. We help them find funding and to find angel investors and things like that. Or if their idea is not good, maybe we can consult with them, explain why, explain what they might want to do, tweaks they might want to make, maybe refer them to different committees that they could have a discussion about it or whatever, and maybe they themselves could learn and realize, oh, wait a minute, I need to change this and I need to change that if I really want to do my idea. A lot of people have ideas and they think that they know a lot, but their ideas are not very well developed. And that's a big difference. And you need to make sure that before you actually just have lateral changes. You know, like Trump came in, he's like, I'm going to sign this bill and sign this bill and sign this bill and sign this bill. He just made this, you know, all these lateral changes. And before you do that, you need to make sure that each thing that you are going to decide, that you've really given it enough thought, and that it's really a very well-developed idea. And that's what we need to ensure, is that all of the decisions that are taken are well thought out decisions. So with the executive branch, you need to have a president that does have a wide range of authority, but without absolute power. So he has absolute authority, but he doesn't have absolute power. Absolute authority without absolute power. So he can basically say, no, we're not going to do that. He can veto whatever, okay? But again, if he gets rogue in any way, he's out. And that is the most efficient and fastest way to get things done. And so if something needs to be done immediately, he can do it. So if there's a natural disaster and there's a volcano that erupts and it kills 20 million people and all this emergency services need to be presented and everything, he doesn't need to go through FEMA or whatever. He can just say, go fix it. And it gets done in a big way. And so he needs to have a lot of power without being bogged down with too many other checks and balances. But again, if his power, you know, if he gets a little bit corrupt, then you need to be able to recall him. And that's the main thing. And even if you can recall him, you still should have term limits. So even if he never gets corrupt, and he's always good, should still have a term limit. There's just because, I mean, we've got 300 million people that live in America. We don't need to have the same one guy in office indefinitely. Give somebody else a chance. Maybe he's got some fresh ideas. Maybe it would be good. I don't see how it would be bad. So he then, the president, would nominate cabinet members that the legislative branch must then approve. He can veto bills proposed by the legislative branch. Judicial branch, federal judges appointed by the executive with the approval of the legislative, and the foundation by a constitution to be used on a basis for the basis of all law. And so basically what we do now, but actually in many ways the Supreme Court has too much power, and it's too divided. It's left or it's right. And it needs to, you need to have more referendums to limit their power and to force them to sort of have a better meeting of the minds. Because when we have a decidedly Republican Supreme Court, all Republican and right-wing ideas get passed. And when we have a majority of Democrats in the Supreme Court, all the liberal, extreme liberal ideas all get passed. And we need to have a balance where we actually have a meeting in the middle somewhere. In the 1950s, the government in America, it was actually the most ideal probably, because we still had what were called moderate conservatives, or liberal conservatives, or we had conservative liberals, or we had moderate liberals, or whatever you want to call them. In other words, people that were in the middle. And we had a guy named Eisenhower who was a Republican, but he was a very liberal and wise Republican. And we've not had a liberal Republican since him. And that's a problem. All right. Then, so how do you have elections? I said it's a form of a democracy. Okay. Publicly funded elections. Absolutely no lobbyists, and business interests have no say at all. So it doesn't matter how much money somebody wants to donate to somebody. Nobody needs it. Once you pass a certain amount of tests and you get to a certain point where you can run for an office on a local level, then your campaign should be federally funded or locally funded, but it should be funded with tax money. And then it should also, you can also set limitations. So nobody can spend more than this. You can have certain guidelines set for what kind of advertising is legitimate and what kind of advertising is not legitimate. So any use of private money will disqualify the candidate. So it would actually, in a way, be harder for a billionaire to become a president, because he would be tempted to maybe use some of his own money to gain an advantage. And if he does that, disqualified. All candidates must pass a presidential civics test. So if you want to run for president, you have to pass the test to make sure that you're qualified. Local elections first, then provincial or state, and then federal. Again, term limits. Also, we should have free education all the way through college. Master's degree can be optional, and maybe those can be private institutions, but all the way through college should be mandatory. Free education, just like they do in Europe. Free health care, again, like what they do in Europe or Australia. Capitalism with social protections, limiting what capitalists can get away with, to make sure that always the best interests of the people are served. We need to promote innovation and entrepreneurs, as I said before. We need to promote renewable energy sources. And a lot of times this is hard to do because you've got a lot of growing pains. Whenever you have significant changeover, you're always going to have a lot of growing pains. So the ultimate changeover that we're going to have to make to go away from fossil fuels and more into renewable sources is going to be a really hard thing to do, because we've become so dependent on fossil fuels that the infrastructure that has to be built in order to create the changeover, is going to really be a hard thing to do. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's something that has to be done. And there's actually no reason at all anymore to use fossil fuels for cars. That's just crazy. It's easier at the moment, but in the long run, it's going to hurt us in a big time. Because once those fossil fuels are gone, they're gone. Forever. We'll never have them again. And we're not going to find them on another planet. We can find diamonds and gold on other planets, but we're not going to find fossil fuels on other planets, because they don't have trees and shrubs and organic life. Okay, we talked about that before. You need to have strict FCC-like regulations regarding journalistic integrity. That's one thing that we have completely lost with the advent of the internet and social media, is journalistic integrity. It doesn't exist anymore. We need to reinstitute journalistic integrity. So you have to have a license to say that you are an official news source. And then those people should not have the ability to just say whatever they want. they need to really verify their sources like they used to have to do. And then anybody else that's a news source can be like an unlicensed an unregulated or an unlicensed news source. And so that has to be like a little banner or something that has to be obvious. So you can click onto your Breitbart or whatever, but if it's not a licensed news service, then you can't really believe or trust anything that it says. It's like reading the National Enquirer. Now you want to have freedom of speech, so you want to allow the National Enquirer, you want to allow the Breitbarts and whatever of the world to say whatever they want to say, but you need to just say, this is like reading the National Enquirer. You know, we can't guarantee that any of this stuff is actually really true. You need to do a lot of fact checking and things like that to make sure that what they're suggesting or saying really is true. You need to check that out. And there's extreme liberal places too, like the USA Today, places like that. Okay, as far as an economic system goes, and this is part of socioeconomics, okay, currency creation based on credit. Currency can be printed at a reasonable price in India, is what I was going to propose, is that they get their currency printed in India. America, Britain, especially Britain, has printing places. Russia too, they print the money from Mongolia, for example. But you know, different places cost different money to have things printed. Taxes imposed on the richest of residents. And they're careful not to drive them away. So you don't want to have too many taxes so that they say, well, I don't want to live here anymore. But you want to have enough, you want to make sure they pay their fair share. And right now they're not. And especially corporations are not paying their fair share. And actually that's the biggest problem with America right now, is that corporations do not pay their fair share. They have so much power and so much control that they do not really pay anything in taxes. And so you've got this huge economic percentage of the economy that's not paying any taxes at all. So where do you get taxes from? I mean, because they're not paying their shares because they control. They run the show, and they're saying we don't want to pay any taxes because we want to give profits to our shareholders. Well, you've got to end that. We have to make sure that they do pay their fair share. And we need to have pure transparency and apply for credit assessment from, okay, ultimately, in order for Hazara Jat to become a country, then they would need to apply S&P or Moody's or Fitch to get rated, so that their currency can be rated. You want to have convertible currency. You don't want non-convertible currency. That's a problem that China has. China has non-convertible currency. So if you're on Forex or something like that, you can't, and so I see these movies like where somebody said, well, I made a lot of money by investing in yuan. Which I laugh out loud when I see that, because you can't do that. Because yuan is not publicly traded. It's not convertible. Nobody can make a lot of money by investing in yuan because it's not convertible currency. You can't trade on a Forex. And the reason why it's not convertible currency is because they are not transparent. They have two separate sets of books. And it's very obvious that they do. So that's why they don't have accreditation from S&P or Moody's or Fitch. Okay. Again, capitalism with social programs and teaching of the importance of consumerism. Because consumerism is a very, very powerful thing that needs to be monitored. You can't just let consumerism run wild the way that it does in America. That's the same way as letting a democracy run wild. There's fallacies of consumerism too. But you want to also acknowledge consumerism too, and acknowledge the importance of consumerism, which they don't do, in like the Soviet Union didn't used to do that. They didn't used to understand consumerism and how important that was. Okay, free education. All right, and strategy for the coup. Weapons needed. Strategy for how we were going to actually win the war. All right. We have a commitment from Mongolia. We have media, social media promotion. This is how we can promote it. Okay, we're going to make a new capital in Bamyan, which is where the new capital was going to be. These were going to be the provinces that would be part of Hazara. Bamyan, Daikandi, most of Gaur, most of Ghazni province, Maidan Vardak, southern parts of Saripul and part of Samangan province. We were going to post armies in 4 key places, in the Bamyan in the center, and the Maidan Vardak Bashut, Dakundi Center, and in Gaur. Offer deal for current public officials. Okay, alert armies form a country from key central areas. Okay. All right. Financing plan. Okay, so we had all that way to finance it. And then who we're going to give it to? Provinces that were involved: Bamyan, Gaur, Daikandi, Ghazni, Maidan, Vardak, Saripul, Samangan, Oruzgan, Badghis, Herat, Parvan, and Kabul. So those would be involved. Okay. All right. Economic sustainability. Tourism at the Bamyan Buddha. I would have them rebuild that because the Taliban blew it up. Unfortunately, there's just this like hole in the mountain where it used to be, and they blew it up, the Bamyan Buddha. But the biggest thing is going to be the mines. So here's the thing about Afghanistan that a lot of people didn't understand. People say, oh, well, Putin's invading Ukraine because he wants the resources. If he really wanted natural resources, he'd invade Afghanistan again. Afghanistan, per cubic mile or whatever, square mile or whatever, probably has the most resources of anywhere in the world. There are trillions, probably $3 trillion worth of natural resources in Afghanistan that right now nobody has access to because the Taliban runs the place, and even the Chinese interests that are there are not able to, operate with full autonomy. They have to go through the Taliban for everything. And so, and most places, most people don't even want to bother. And so all the mining that should be being done in Afghanistan is not being done because nobody wants to get involved with that. Economically, you would set up a mine and then the Taliban would just take it away from you. I mean, it's too volatile. But there's a lot of money in natural resources there. So, but not in Ukraine. They don't have that many natural resources. The most valuable part of Ukraine is Crimea. And I think I mentioned that before. All right. I would set up movie production. Making westernized movie. I would set up, there's a ski resort. I would set up a big ski resort in some of the mountainous areas, which they don't do. Also, I would try to improve or increase the production of saffron, which is something that only Afghanistan does. And it's a cool spice. And in areas where otherwise it's hard to grow things, we need to set up greenhouses in those areas so that we can have expand agricultural things. And then an entrepreneur association was going to be the last thing. To promote domestic entrepreneurs by creating a website that would connect would-be creative businesses and angel investors. And actually, I had designed. It's called It was called I can't remember the ID. I can't remember the name of the business anymore. But I had created a website or planned for a website that would do this. That was very definitive. So I could actually give you a definitive plan for how that website should be done and developed. That's we need to have something like that. We should have that everywhere. Every country should have that. But I was going to have that with this Hazara Jat country. All right, and I think that about covers it. So that's the Hazara Jat plan, and that's a plan that could be used for anywhere. And so part of the idea that I had was that the model that we would create and established in Hazara Jat would be successful, and that other countries maybe would look to it and say, oh, kind of like they did to America, in the late 1700s. France looked at America and they were like, yeah, it's working pretty good. And maybe other countries could see the success and use it as a successful model, and maybe eventually changes could happen internationally to make places more in line with what we're doing in Hazara Jat. So that was the original plan for that. But ultimately, I think these socioeconomic government concepts, plans can be utilized in any country in the world, and should be, including America. All right, so that's the end of this lesson. Again, this was episode 18. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, please remember to like, share, or subscribe. And that's it for this time. We'll see you next time. I'm Scott Powers Houston, signing off from Learning with Power. Have a nice day.